Amen. Well, good evening, church. My name is Breazeale. I am the North Campus pastor, one of the elders here. It's good to be with you. So my guess is for the past almost 4 months now, we've been in the book of 1 Peter, and my guess is that thus far you've really liked what Peter has said for the most part. It's been challenging at times, but you have probably liked the encouragement that Peter has given us. Peter said that we are elect exiles. He said that we belong to God. He has said that Jesus has now secured us. We have this inheritance that's in heaven that's been kept for us, that's undefiled, unshakable. You have this certain future in Him. He died for you. He rose for you. All this language that Peter has been using, that we're a chosen race, we're a royal priesthood, we now belong to God, we're God's own people for His own possession. My guess is all that language has encouraged you. It's kind of stirred you up to love and to good deeds. Even the passages on holiness, which are very demanding and very severe, a part of you just resonates and thinks, that's a good thing for me to pursue this, even though it's hard at times. And so my guess is, for the most part, just kind of at face value, what we have said thus far, what you have read thus far in 1 Peter, you've really, really liked it until tonight, maybe. At first glance, whenever you see this topic tonight, this issue tonight, at first glance, you might feel yourself just kind of recoiling a bit and wanting to push back against this and raise all kinds of questions and all kinds of what-if scenarios. And so the issue that Peter is going to address in this text now, we come to, is the topic of government. And so what do Christians do when it comes to government, when it comes to authorities, when it comes to presidents and rulers and leaders and laws and taxes and all these things that come down to us? What do Christians, how do we respond to that? Do we protest? Do we ignore it? Do we fight against it? Do we post things on social media about it? Like, what do we do? Maybe we could do those things, but the very first thing that Peter says that we are to do is to submit. All right, now just breathe. I know that your world just collapsed in so many ways right now. But Peter says that first and foremost, the Christian, we are called to be subject to submit, to yield to government, to think about, how can I obey this? How can I do what government says? The first question that you should ask is, how can I subject myself to what government says on a given topic? Now, there's way more to say on that. There's way more to talk about in terms of, scenarios that we'll get into, and we'll do a few of these here, a few of these in a bit. But the first question that you need to be asking is, how can I submit to this and be subject to what government says? That's what the Word of God says to us when it comes to your posture, when it comes to your demeanor, when it comes to your posting on social media, when it comes to your conversation with your coworkers and friends and classmates and teammates. The very first thing is you submit. And I want to show you tonight just how good that is, that when Peter uses the word submit or be subject to, he sees that as a good thing. Now, we live in a very anti-authority culture, so any authority that tries to be over us, we want to push back and protest and just resist that in the name of being free. We think if I submit to something, I can't be free. And so I need my freedoms, I need my liberties, and so if I submit, that will restrict me and I can't actually have freedom. But if you think about it, whenever you submit to something, you are, in essence, you are actually pursuing freedom. So, for example, if you play music, you have to submit to certain notes and keys and rhythms. If you rebel against those things, you can't play music well. And so every musician, you have to submit to what the page says, and that's what frees you up to actually play a song that's pleasing to our ears. If you learn a language, you have to submit to certain linguistics and grammatical laws and syntax and vocabulary. And so you submit in order to do what? To be freed up to actually speak the language and be fluent in the language. Otherwise, that restricts you by not submitting to it. Whenever you drive, you submit to certain traffic laws and speed limits when cops are around and, stop signs. But you do that, why? Not to restrict you, but to actually prevent you from hurting yourself or harming someone else or getting some penalty or getting your license taken away. And so you're doing that to gain freedom. And so when it comes to this topic of submission, submission in and of itself is never a bad thing. It's a good thing. You're actually finding your freedom. In fact, whenever you rebel, that's when you usually restrict yourself. So if a fish rebels against water, it's not free. It is on land, and it is now a slave to the air. It's not free. So if you rebel, if your immediate thought is, how can I rebel? How can I push back? How can I question? How can I resist this? That actually limits your freedom. And so whenever Peter says to be subject, when the Bible calls us to submit, it sees that as a very, very good thing. And I want to show you how tonight, of how winsome this text is for us, how timely it is for us, how thoughtful, how insightful this is as we put this into practice. However, it's going to challenge all of us. It's going to push back, most likely, wherever you land on these topics, whatever your thoughts are, whatever your positions are when it comes to politics and government and leaders, all those things. This text is going to push back against that. And so I spent about 25 hours this week just with this text, and trust me, it's a difficult passage to grapple with. So you will be offended by it tonight, all right? So be encouraged by that. Here's what Peter says, chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Peter says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor." So Peter is saying that when it comes to government and laws that come down and policies that are enforced and rulers and senators and authorities over us and city officials and police officers and tax brackets and all of these things, all these codes you have to live up to, all of these things, the Christian first seeks to come under that authority and obey and defer and submit to what the government says. Okay, now he's not saying that you need to like everything that government says or support everything that government says or champion everything that government says, because you can't, and likely you can't because you're a Christian in some circles, in some situations, but you likely won't like all those things. He's not saying that you love all that government says. He is saying, though, that the posture and your demeanor and the way that you view government, there must be this submissive and gentle and quiet posture that we have toward government, and we seek to subject ourselves to what and to obey what it says. Now, you have to get here. Again, there are all kinds of scenarios and all kinds of questions that raises up of what about this situation, what about this law, and we'll get into some of those things. But first, when it comes to this idea, you need to let this sink down into your system and actually grapple with this and let it change your demeanor and your posture and your speech when it comes to political issues and to our government. All right, this is God's word to us. It's not my word. And so we have to somehow get here that our posture toward government is one of submission and subjection. I want to show you how tonight. There are three things that I think from this text that if you know, you can submit to and be in subjection to any government, any law that comes down, any cabinet in office, you can submit to and be subject if you know three things. All right, so if you're taking notes, all four of you out there, one, you need to know that God ordains all government. Number two, that you have been freed in the gospel to now obey government. And three, only God is worthy of your worship and your trust. All right, so God ordains government. You're free in the gospel to obey government, but God alone is worthy of your worship and your trust. If you can get that, if you can just love those three ideas, those three truths, you can submit to any governing authority, any human institution in this life. Now, before I get too far in, let me offer just one caveat here. Peter is not giving us a way to do politics in this text. In other words, he's not telling us, and nor am I telling you, where you need to land on every political issue and topic. He's not telling us who to vote for or what party to align ourselves with or where to land on foreign policy or on the federal budget or on spending or immigration. He's not telling us this is where, if you're a Christian, you should think like this on these topics. He's not doing that, nor does the Bible do that. The Bible does not offer us a political vision that tells us how to respond to every single political question. Okay, there are complex issues that we do not have direct and simple answers to for every one of them in the Bible. Murder, yeah, got that one down. There are lots of other issues, okay? Federal budget, there's no text that says it needs to be like this, okay? Those are complex issues. Now, we have lots of principles in the Bible that we should be thinking deeply about and moving in this conversation with. But when it comes to simple and direct answers to all these questions, the Bible just doesn't, that's not the intent of the Bible. It's not meant to do that, and nor am I telling you that tonight. Okay, we can talk later about those things. Be glad to have that conversation. But for now, I'm giving you a posture. Peter's giving us a posture to how we view government. So my guess is that some of you lean more Republican, some of you lean more Democratic, some of you are somewhere in the middle, some of you just don't care, the rest of you are angry about this, so we're glad you're here. Welcome to the Austin Stone, okay? But I say this because the danger here is that we might try to align Jesus with our particular political viewpoint. And that just you can't do that. You cannot align him and just pin him down on a certain issue and say, he aligns with my political views. My views are Jesus' view. What's your view on foreign policy? Jesus' view. Well, what view is that? How do you know those things? We just don't have that. So Jesus is not the true and better Democrat or Republican or Libertarian. He's not conservative or progressive or liberal or moderate. You cannot pin him down in this conversation. There's a place in the book of Joshua where Joshua, who's leading Israel after Moses, where the Lord appears to Joshua. And I love the scene because Joshua doesn't know who it is. And so this man appears to Joshua, this exalted angel. And Joshua asks him, he says, are you for us or are you for our enemies? Are you for Israel or are you for Jericho? And the angel says, God says, no. You for us? Are you for them or are you for us? Whose side are you on? And the angel says, no. He's not on anyone's side. He doesn't align himself the same way that we think about aligning ourselves to one party or one team. That's not how it works with Jesus. And so I say all this just to caution us that we're not getting a political vision for how to do politics. We're getting a posture toward how we think of and align ourselves as Christians with government. Is that fair? If it's not, then it's going to have to be for a few minutes, so as long as you're here. So let me give you 3 thoughts on how I think if you believe these things, you can submit and have a tone to your life about this topic that will compel people around you that the world has never seen when it comes to this. All right, number 1, you have to believe that God ordains all government. God's the one, so government is first and foremost, it's God's idea, not the people's idea or man's idea, not directly. God is the one that sets up all kingdoms, all governments, all authorities. They belong to him. Now, here's what Peter says. 2 things that he says here. Notice how Godward Peter is about this. Verse 13, he says to be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Now, he does not say be subject for the emperor's sake or to the state's sake. He's saying for the Lord's sake, for Jesus' sake and his name and his glory, that's why you should be subject. It's because of him, not the nation itself. Then he says in verse 15, for this is the will of God. The will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. We'll come back to what that means in a second. So what he's saying is, by submitting, by doing good to government, you are actually living out God's will for your life. You want to know what God's will is for your life? Be subject to government. That's God's will for you. So what he's saying is, God willed the government in place that you might submit to government, and by doing that, you honor and you glorify Jesus. That's what's going on here. So the point is that God's the one that wills the government. God ordains and appoints the government. So all those governors, all those leaders, every single person that's in an office, a governmental office, the Lord has placed them there is what's going on here. It's a pretty astonishing thought. Now, Peter implies that, I think, pretty strongly, but Paul says this explicitly in the book of Romans. Here's what Paul says, Romans 13. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist, those authorities that exist, have been instituted by God." So despite what, political philosophers and scientists might say on this, the government is not appointed by the people. It's not directly given and made by people. So God is the one that instituted by this. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Later on in Romans 13, Paul calls basically the emperor God's servant. God is using him to restrain evil and to promote good. That's what's going on here. So Paul is saying us that God is the one that appointed and puts government in place. All those laws and taxes and officials, all those are there under the authority of God. God appointed them, so the Bible's claiming that the righteous and unrighteous, the ones that should be there, the ones that shouldn't be there, all those rulers God put in place and God established. Now, there's a lot of mystery in that. Again, there's there's direct causes, there's indirect causes for that, but the first word and the final word rests with God. Now, Greg Forster, who is a political scientist, PhD, Yale, spooky smart guy, has written a lot on Christians and government, and he says that in history, only Christians have claimed this when it comes to government. He says that no other religion has argued or claimed that every authority that's in place was ordained by their God. That only Christians talk like this. And what's amazing is that for the most part, at least in Peter's day, Christians were a minority. They were marginalized. They had no power, no rights, they couldn't demand, they had no voice. And they are saying, our God placed Caesar there. The world power of the day, Christians are saying, they're looking above all those emperors and kings and powers to God, who's sovereign over all things and who has the final word. And that's why they could submit. You see that? Because they knew that all these kingdoms and all these emperors, they all have a shelf life. All the Caesars, they come and go. Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and all of these nations, they're like, all flesh is like grass. It just rises and they fall. Every kingdom is like this, and that's why they could submit. Now, in addition to all this, God intends there to be good for government. God has good intentions for government. He ordained it for good purposes, and the purposes are to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. And so it's the intention is to restrain the heart of man. Unless there be just wickedness that is unleashed on this world in just countless ways, that's why government is in place, to restrain evil. And so imagine if there's no government and no laws and no restrictions and no prisons and no police officers and nothing in place to stop the heart of man, evil just runs rampant. We've seen that historically. So the book of Judges, the book says that there was no king in Israel at this time, and everyone did what? What's right in their own eyes. And that book, the book of Judges, turns bloody it goes Quentin Tarantino, really quickly when people are just doing what's right in their own eyes. It gets really bloody and gory and messy, and these are the Israelites. Israel is just unleashing all this wickedness and corruption and sin on the world because there's no one in place to restrain them is what's happening here. So you don't want a scenario where there's no government. Okay, we couldn't live this way. There are countless good things and good laws that are in place to free you up to actually live. Uber's coming back. You guys heard this, right? Uber is coming back to our city. How great is that? That's a governmental decision that went down there. These are good things that are in place, and you want there to be government, okay? Now, I can hear you asking the question right now. I can see your faces. What about unjust government? Great, I'll submit to, a government that aligns with my values as a person and my causes and the things that I like. But what about what about evil and unjust government? What do we do then? If we're under some government that just continually brings these laws down, is there no place for resistance? Is there no place for making our voices heard and pushing back? Is this just blind obedience that Peter is calling us to here? Now, I'll come back to that, I promise. Let me just say here, though, I think it's a good place to say this. The Bible only knows unjust government. When Peter writes this, there is no thought of a democracy or voting or an election or actually selecting your own leaders. That is nowhere on the radar in the Bible, okay? They only know unjust government. So think of all the people that, the nations that Israel dealt with or that Jesus or the apostles or the church, they all dealt with. These were wicked nations. You go back and look in the book of Exodus and you see Egypt and you see Pharaoh and he's supreme, he's demanding that he is the ruler of the world and that he has all power. You go in and look at Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who demands worship. You look at Assyria and the Ninevites and just all of these nations. They're all corrupt governments and rulers and officials. Then you get into the New Testament and it's Rome, it's the Caesars. The Caesars are some of the most just wicked and deviant and corrupt rulers in the history of the world. That's just a historical certainty. We know they demanded worship. They saw themselves often as divine or the Son of God even. So whenever a Caesar was born, they would send out messengers throughout the empire declaring, gospel. They're actually saying, go declare the gospel now because the king is born. He's here, the Son of God is born. Go declare this news. That's how they saw him as supreme and divine. And by the way, the one that Peter's talking about, Nero, he would eventually cut Paul's head off and crucify Peter upside down, many historians think. That's who we're talking about right now. And so it's in this environment that Peter is saying to submit. So my point is, the Bible just doesn't know a just government. And that is the place where you find these laws about submission. So my guess is that of the 45 U.S. presidents that we have seen, at least one of them has offended you in some way. Shouldn't be a stretch to think that, okay? They've said things, they've done things, they've put things in place, they've made promises they didn't keep. These things happen and it angered you, it upset you, it shook you, it made you just maybe angry on the inside and scared on the inside. I bet that has happened. None of them have crucified Christians. None of them have cut a pastor's head off. None of them have claimed to be God. At least not yet. They've not done that. We just don't know this kind of corruption, this kind of wickedness when it comes to government. And listen, I'm not saying it should be this way. I am not arguing that we should hope for this kind of government over us. By no means. It is not a biblical prayer to pray for persecution. We're not in no way suggesting that. I'm just saying that we don't know this kind of persecution, this kind of pushback, and this kind of government. And so, if you think that I've heard this from people that I know. If you think that things like gun regulations and gun laws is Christian persecution, you've not read your Bible very well lately. That's not the same thing. I mean, there are certain lawsuits that come down that are kind of making their way into the media and these things, and there's beginning to be hints of some opposition and some pushback. We are nowhere remotely close to someone demanding that we worship them or else our heads are cut off. We're nowhere close to that. So the point is, Peter is saying in the midst of that environment to be subject. He's saying that you actually can submit to government and be a good citizen and honor the emperor and obey what the king says. Why? Because God ordains all of this. And the church submitted and they often suffered at times and they bled and they died, but the church flourished because you couldn't stop them. Like you couldn't stop the spread of the church. it just continues. It's like Jell-O. You slap it and it just spreads everywhere. You can't stop it because God is the one who's behind this, and all those emperors and kings, they all have this shelf life, and they knew that. Knowing that, you can now submit. You can pray for your leaders. You can promote the good. You can honor them. You can respect them. You can speak in a way that's kind and gentle because you know that you're obeying God, not them, ultimately. You're living out God's will for your life, not their will for your life. If you know this, you can be subject. All right, number 2. You must know that God has now freed you in the gospel. You know Jesus. You are free from every government, from every human law, from every human institution. You are free, all right? But you're free to now submit. Here's what he says, verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood. Love the church is what he's saying there. And so Peter is reminding us that we're free. You are free in Christ from everything. Every law, every institution, every government and president and king and emperor, you are free from them. In the gospel, God has freed us from every earthly identity and every hold on your life. You are free now, but you're free to submit. You are a slave to God, and being a slave to God means you're free from everything, but you're free now to submit and to be subject. You've been rescued now to obey government. You see what he's saying? So God has, and again, there's a tension here to walk in. There's a paradox here to walk in that you're freed up now to be subject to the government. But don't use your freedom, he says, as a cover-up for evil. What does that mean? Well, it means that, think about what Peter has said thus far. He said in this letter, he's called them all kinds of things. He's called them a chosen race, a royal priesthood. They are a holy nation. They're living stones being built up. Christ is their cornerstone. They now belong to God. They were once not a people. Now they're God's people. They're elect. They're chosen. All flesh is like grass. They wither and they fall, but God's word remains forever. All this language. And if you hear that, the reaction might be, well, who needs the government then? I mean, Rome has no, if this is true, if I belong to God, then Rome has no hold on me. I'm not paying taxes. Like, I'm not going to do these things and obey the state if I belong to him, if I'm a holy nation and a whole new priesthood in God, I'm not going to obey Caesar or the emperor or the state. Forget them. That is using your freedom to cover up evil, is what Peter's saying. So what he's getting at here is that you should use your freedom now to actually obey and to do good. We're not anarchists. Christians are not trying to overthrow government. We are not some threat. We're not trying to undo the powers and resist and protest. And we're not trying to demand our rights and always yelling and complaining and protesting and pushing back. Nor are we going to cower into a corner, though, and just hope that Reagan comes back and saves all of us. That's not the hope either. That's not what we're doing. We speak a lot. We speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. So we speak for the unborn. And we speak for the orphan and for the widow and for the fatherless and for the poor. We seek justice. We seek the good of our country. We seek in every possible way to promote the good, to adorn the gospel, to press forth justice. We labor for racial reconciliation. All those things, they matter to us. And so Peter's saying, be a good citizen. Right? Don't let someone malign the gospel, but seek to advance the gospel. So we're good citizens. We want to love our country. And we want to see the blessings God has given to us by our government, by our country, and leverage those for the good. This is a great place to live, by the way. It's an amazing country we live in. Did you know, by the way, that, I say this all 3 times today, so did you know that the U.S. government, if a zombie apocalypse were to break out, that could happen. Okay, I've watched some shows on this. There are scenarios where this could happen. So we could all, that might happen. If a zombie apocalypse breaks out, our government has a plan for that. There is actually, you can look this up, I think I'm right on this. The government has a plan that if an apocalypse breaks out, there is a backup plan already in place. How cool is that? There are so many, aside from that, there are so many good things and right things that you can attribute by God's grace, by God's common grace, to government. And so we want to seek to promote the good in this country, but most of all, we want to seek to advance the gospel and do everything that we can to adorn this gospel. So that's what Peter's saying, I think, in verse 15. He says, "For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." Here's what I think Peter is saying. So at this time in history, Christianity is very new. It's only maybe a few decades old, probably. And so it's a new movement. It's a new religion. There's something going on there that hasn't happened before. And so if you're a government, you see this new sect kind of breaking out and gaining a pretty big following, you start to ask questions. I mean, are they a threat? Is this some new rebellion? Is this some new resistance for us to put down? Is this some, new riots and, some new mutiny to somehow deal with? Are they a threat to our government is what they're asking. And no one knew what to do with Christians in the first century. I mean, because the book of Acts shows us that in certain places, Christians were mocked, they were beaten, they were killed, they were laughed at, they were worshiped. Like Paul goes into certain cities and they start offering sacrifices to Paul and the apostles. They don't know what to do with them. They turn the world upside down is what they say in the book of Acts. They're saying that there's a different king. They won't call Caesar Lord, yet they still pay their taxes. And so no one knew what to do with first century Christians. They didn't know what category to file them into. And so Peter's saying there's going to be some suspicion and some accusations against you. They don't know what to do with the church. Do not give them any reason to malign the gospel. Let your conduct be so excellent among the Gentiles, they would see your good deeds and glorify God day of visitation. You do good, be good citizens, you pay your taxes, you use your blinker, you obey laws, like you do all the good things, that no one would malign the gospel. That by your doing good, you would silence any false accusations, any foolish claims against the gospel being some new mutiny on Rome's hands. That's not what's going on there. And so Peter says you have now been freed up in the gospel to obey and submit to government. So I want to say this, the way that you posture yourself toward government, it reflects how you view the gospel. It really does. The way that you see government, the way that you respond, it really shows how much you are leaning into your freedom in Jesus. So if you're constantly complaining and mocking and fighting and debating when it comes to our government and always just posting things on social media and your speech is just filled with anger and aggression, I want to say to you that you are not remembering who you are in Jesus. You are belittling the gospel. You are belittling in your life the finished work of Christ on your behalf. And there's a better way. Right now, everyone, you just turn on any device and look on Twitter, Facebook, or blogs, or news apps. Everyone right now is maligning and mocking and protesting government. It is everywhere. Maybe like never before since I've been alive, for sure. I've never seen this much just aggressive tone and the bite or just constant mocking on SNL and talk shows and all these things. And maybe I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's where things are right now. And I just don't want the church and for us to fall into that and to just fall in line with that. Everyone's doing that. Show them a better way. If you know Jesus, there is a better way. You don't have to demand your rights and protest and fight all the time. You can actually be silent and submissive, and that win people. There is a better way. So if you just fall in line with that, you're not, no one's compelled by that. Because right now, everyone's doing this, and Jesus shows us a better way to respond to government, and this is it. A kind and submissive tone that's filled with goodness. Again, not saying that you don't speak. You should speak. But your voice just has a persuasiveness and a tone and a winsomeness and a kindness, and that's what persuades people. It's the anger, the aggression, the frustration, the bitterness. No one is moved by that. You're just falling in line with every person in the world right now on this topic. Let's show them a better way, because Jesus has freed us from all of this. So why don't we have to always feel like we have to appear strong on these topics? Why aren't we so afraid to be seen as inferior on these issues, to lose from time to time? Jesus showed us the upside down kingdom, which means that the way up is down. The way to win is by losing. The way to be great is by serving. The way to live is by dying. It's an upside down kingdom. That's always how it's going to be. And we can navigate this. We can live in this tension and show the world a better way. Now, if you work in government or you plan to work in government, be amazing at your job. Promote the good and seek justice and come in early and work with integrity and thoughtfulness and care and kindness and be faithful in these things. Show the world a better way. You're free from all of that. Show them how Jesus responds to those who are in power. But also love the brotherhood. And what he means by that is let the church be the church. Let the world see you loving and serving and caring and laying your life down, showing that you believe that you are a different person because of who Jesus is. This is the way that he has shown us. Last thing, and I'll move on. Martin Luther has said in his little book on Christian liberty, Luther says this, that a Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. You are free, Lord of all, subject to no one. And he says a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject of all, subject to all. There's your tension right there. So live and walk in this tension and show the world you've been freed up now to be subject to government. Number 3, and we're done. Know that God alone deserves our worship and our trust. So what I want to say here is that Caesar is going to have limits when it comes to our subjection and our obedience. One of the commentaries that I read for this said that in these last 2 phrases, Peter is subtly pushing back against government. So the last 2 things that Peter says, he ends this section by saying, fear God, honor the emperor. You can almost hear Peter preaching, saying, fear God, but honor the emperor. So right here, side by side, you have 2 kingdoms, two allegiances, 2 powers side by side, and they are utterly different. They couldn't be more different. One of them, God's kingdom, is eternal and everlasting and just and beautiful and glorious. One is not. One is all-powerful and one is not. One will last forever and cover the earth as the water covers the sea, and one, like all other kingdoms, will rise and it will fall. And Peter's saying, you fear God. Fear means that we love him. It means that we utterly trust him, that our hope is in him, that our entire life is built around him. That means you fear God. Peter's saying you fear him, but you can still honor the emperor. There's a place in Matthew 22 where Jesus, they're trying to trick him in this whole political, conversation. And they say to him, the Pharisees, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? What do you say, Jesus? Do you want us to obey God or obey Rome? Are you for Israel and God's name, or are you for Caesar and Rome's name? Who are you for? What do we do? Do we pay him or not? And Jesus says, bring me a coin. And they bring him a coin, and he says, whose image is on this? And the text says, they said Caesar's. And by the way, we still have these coins today. You can see these online somewhere. The coin actually has an image of Caesar. And so they say Caesar's, and he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And when they heard it, they marveled. And they left him and they went away. Why are they marveling over this whole thing with the coin? Well, think about it. Where is Caesar's image? It's on the coin. So he's saying, give it back to Caesar. His face is on this. Now, if it's on there, then you give it back to him. There's his image, wherever you see it. So what he's saying is pay your taxes. Obey the state. Do what government says. For the most part, if at all possible, you obey and do what the government says with all of your might. You see his image, give it back to him, but give to God what is God's. Where do you see God's image? It's you. You are in the image of God. God's image, God's likeness, it's on us. And so what he's saying is, yes, you can honor Caesar, but you fear God. You give yourself to him. You love him. You owe him everything. You owe Caesar taxes. You owe God your life because his image is on you. And so the point is that Caesar is going to have limits, and Congress and Supreme Court and the U.S. government, it's going to have limits on how far as Christians that we can actually obey. And so we are subject and we obey in every way except for one. When it means that we have to disobey God, we humbly resist. So if the state issues some policy or some law, and there are things that are in place right now that this scenario could be a reality for us. But when it means that if we have to disobey God in order to obey the state, then we resist obeying the state. We gently and we humbly, we don't demand our rights, we don't triumphantly stand for truth. In fear and trembling, we resist what government says because we fear God more than we fear government. We hope in him more than we hope in government. And if we have to suffer a bit, then we suffer. If it hurts, then we just have to endure because Jesus will be enough for us. Now, we can't just make this up. We can't make up things that we think this is what I can protest and rebel against. That's not our option for us, okay? The line must be very, very clear. If you are going to the language that we've, Thoreau used was civil disobedience. If you're going to use that language, you better be really clear what the lines are. So examples of this in the Bible are when the Hebrew midwives, whenever they wouldn't do what Pharaoh said and kill the babies, that's an example of this. When Daniel and the Hebrew men would not bow down to the idols and, and to the Nebuchadnezzar, that's an example of this. They had to obey God, not worship anything else. It cost them their lives, well, at least a threat to their life, but they still obeyed. We see the apostles saying, we can't stop speaking about what we've seen and heard. We must obey God, not man, when it comes to gospel preaching. Jesus said, go announce this. And if that means in prison and beating and suffering and death, we're going to endure it. So for us, the line must be clear here, but if this happens in our day, if we see a time when the government unleashes all kinds of, penalties and taxes and all kinds of fines on us for preaching the gospel, then we're going to have to gently and humbly resist that and endure some pain. But again, Jesus will be enough for us, and we shouldn't be appalled if that happens in our day. Again, I'm not predicting this. I'm not hoping for that. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying if this happens, we shouldn't be appalled by it. I mean, we believe some very, very exclusive and difficult things about who God is. That's going to cost us. But if it costs us, our King will be enough for us because he went first. You want to see someone submit to government and even unjust government? Look at Jesus dying for you. Jesus submitted himself and was subject in every conceivable way to governing authorities. He went first on this. He stands in Pilate's court there and says to Pilate, you have no power over me except what's been given to you from above. In other words, I'm letting you do this to me. I'm letting you arrest me and have me flogged and beaten and punched and spit on and crucified. I'm letting you do this. You would have no power over me unless I had given you this. You wouldn't have this power over me. And so Jesus subjects himself to Pilate and to Herod, who was in, the tetrarch of Judea. He submits himself to Caesar and the governor and Rome and the centurions and the Pharisees and all these. He submits himself, but why? Because he is accomplishing his Father's will. He knows that God has sovereignly placed all those leaders there, and he is doing something to undo all of them in due time. He is choosing the power of powerlessness to eventually undo all the kingdoms, all the powers in this world, and that's where our hope is. That's why you can submit. If you have a problem right now with where our government is, look at Jesus dying for you and submitting to government for you and giving himself. Caesar only takes life. Caesar only lives for himself. Our king, he gives his life. Ed Clowney has said that Jesus did not come with a sword in his hand. He came with nails in his hand. He did not come wielding power and authority and might. He came humbly. He came broken. He came giving his life, laying it down for us. He came with nails in his hand, and that's where our hope is. And so you can submit because of that, because you're free in that. And God has ordained all these governing authorities over us for a short time for us to be subject to, and by doing that, we show the world how good this king is. Let me say two things and I'm done. There are two errors, I think, that this text will expose in us on these issues. One error is that you can care too much about political issues, and this text is going to kind of call you out on this. Maybe that's you tonight. Maybe you are just constantly have this inner strife, and you're fighting, you're debating, and you're constantly clamoring and angry about government. And you're watching talk shows and got podcasts, and you're just plugged into all the conversation politically. That's not a bad thing, but maybe your hope is rising and falling with what happens in Washington. And if that's the case, you need to sit with this text for a while and see Jesus obeying this text for us first, and let God soften your heart. Maybe you just need to be silent for a season on these issues and take a fast from some media on these topics, and just let God humble you and kind of recorrect some misplaced hope in you right now. That's one error. The second error is that you can care too little about politics. Maybe some of you tonight, you're like, I don't care about any of these laws, any government. I don't care who is in office. I just don't care. And that might feel spiritual to you. It might seem like I'll just back away and never engage any of this stuff, and that feels somehow noble. Again, this text won't let you do that, really. Now, again, there are degrees for all of us as to how much we are engaged in these topics. I get that. But all of us are called to do good. All of us are called to seek to promote justice and be good citizens and promote the good and advance the gospel and adorn the gospel and put to silence any foolish claims against the gospel. That's what we're called to do, which means you need to care. You need to care about what happens in this country and pray for your leaders and call certain officials with respectable titles and names and have a tone to your voice that actually shows that you're engaged with these things. That promotes and adorns the gospel. So I want to encourage you to leverage, this political conversation, it provides so many avenues for us to talk about the gospel and show the gospel. And so I want to encourage you to leverage this conversation for the sake of advancing the gospel and the kingdom. All right, I'm done. Be subject for the Lord's sake, not the state's sake, but for the Lord's sake and His name and His glory to every human institution. Let me pray for us and we'll sing. Father, I ask that, God, even right now, that if we just kind of feel this sense that we want to get out from under this and we want to ignore this, God, that you would maybe stop us in our tracks and that you would correct us, that you would gently just move us to a place where we just have the right thoughts on how to posture ourselves toward the government, God, that you've put in place, that you have ordained. God, we don't always understand why certain people are in office and why certain laws come down and why certain nations are governed the way that they are, but God, we trust that you are sovereign over all of that. And so may our hope be in you. May our joy not rise and fall over what happens in this country and in our economy and who's in office and what cabinet and what leaders are in place. God, our joy and our hope is in you. So help us to live that out. God, would you use us in this conversation to be salt and to be light in this city? God, I pray that people would honestly would change their views of the gospel because of conversations that you have given us with them. That our speech, our conduct, our longing to do what is just and right would compel people. God, may our deeds shine light that people would see and would honor you because of. So God, use us up. God, correct us. I pray that you would help us, that you would lead us to repentance if that's needed right now. That if we have been just filled with anger and rage and a sense of hopelessness over this, God, would you just maybe lift our chins up tonight and remind us that you're in control, and remind us that our hope is not in this country. God, that our citizenship, though we love this country, we love and we want to see it flourish, God, we belong to you. And God, you set the agenda for our lives, and you set the tone for who we are. And so, Jesus, we look to you. We bow down to no one but you. We trust in no one and no kingdom but yours. And so, God, give us grace to live this out tonight and this week and the rest of this year. And I pray that you would use this to have ripple effects in this conversation for us. God, use us up. Jesus, be glorified through us. We pray this in your great name. Amen.